From Castle Rexworth and the Rexworth Estates, I bid you good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are and whenever you are. My name is Rexworth, Lord Rexworth, and I welcome you to a Tuesday night stream where we'll be doing some reading ASMR of Follow the Saint by Leslie Charteris. I believe we are into the final portion of the novella, the final story, and we left on a cliffhanger last week. We're going to pick up there where we left off. But first, I do need to go ahead and make a few announcements here. First off, we just hit the 200 follow mark today on Twitch. And I'm just absolutely chuffed at that. That's something I just, all of this has been so unexpected, and it's so gratifying that there are so many of you here to share in this journey with me. And so I'm grateful for each and every one of you. I thank you all so very much, and I will definitely have to plan something extra special to celebrate this milestone of 200. It seems like almost yesterday we were celebrating, and over the fact that there were 50 of us, and now there's 200, actually just over 200, because shortly before I came on stream here, we got another one, a 201st noble, and that is my Samissar. So thank you so much for the follow. Yeah. Been a while, hasn't it, Raimi? Welcome in, by the way. Certainly has been a while. Feels like it's been a while, and certainly a lot has happened between then and now. A lot has changed in my life. A lot has gone on this year. This has been a very busy year. Yeah, a lot. But we made it, and we're almost through to the end of the year, if you can believe that. I was joking earlier with everybody on the Discord that if you blink and all of a sudden it'll be Christmas, and lo and behold, it seems like that's exactly what's happening. The weeks are just sort of flying by, and just go through October. Yeah, exactly. It has been quite the journey. So this will wait. It isn't Christmas yet. No, not yet. Despite the constant barrage of Christmas carol and Christmas music that's being played in the shops and all. No, there is no. It's not yet Christmas, but they certainly are wanting to set up that Christmas vibe. I do believe that a lot of retailers around the world are quite concerned over the possibility that they could be having a rather difficult year financially, and so they're trying to just cajole as many people for as long as possible. Hey, come spend your money and come buy our things. So that seems to be the driving force behind why you're hearing so much Christmas music already, and why you're seeing so many early Black Friday sales and a lot of Christmas promotions. I will go ahead and say I have been preparing the Christmas stream theme for Castle Rexworth, and those of you who are already in the Discord, you got a sneak peek at what that's going to look like. I'm not going to implement it yet. I am going to wait until probably the last week of November, first week of December, before I unveil all of that. I think that only appropriate, and then it'll have some Christmas lights and other things in there, and then we'll slowly start to transition back. They're going to be for the interstitial screens for starting soon, be right back, and stream ending. Those will have a wintry theme that will continue on, I believe, through February. They're not really Christmas themed per se, but have a lovely rendering of a castle, we'll say it's Castle Rexworth, and it'll be a vision of Castle Rexworth in the snow, and that will keep at least that portion going. And the scene that's going to be set up is we're going to be moving things over to the living room, to the grand room of Castle Rexworth, where the Christmas tree will be set up, and then after the Christmas and New Year's holiday, we shall move back here into the grand study of Castle Rexworth, and meanwhile keep the snowy theme of Castle Rexworth on the starting soon, be right back, and stream ending screens. But yeah, just sort of ease everybody in a little bit. After Christmas, we'll take away some of the Christmas light overlays. I've got like a little string of Christmas lights that will be running on top of the screen, and doing like gameplay or video reacts or whatnot. And that will stay in place from about last week of November, first week of December, and that will stay in place until New Year's, and then we'll take down the Christmas lights and return to the grand study here, to the library. And then once we start getting into February and into early part of spring, we'll start to transition back to the starting soon, be right back stream ending screens that you're already familiar with, that we've been using as part of this theme that I've titled the Castle Rexworth Library. So just sort of easing in and then sort of easing out, as it were, a smooth transition that will take place from week to week. Yeah, going back to the classics. Exactly. So, won't want to miss that. Let's go ahead and get the website up there. All links are available, of course, at lordrexworth.com. That is lordrexworth.com. My throne page, you see the animation there in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Gifts always appreciated by His Lordship. You can check out my throne page at throne.com/Lord Rexworth. Also got the Throne-powered shop. You can support His Lordship through purchases at the Throne shop. Items specially curated by yours truly, of which I will get a small commission. LordRexworth.store. LordRexworth.store. Join the Castle Rexworth Discord by clicking that link in the chat. The gates are open, so join today and keep up to date and stay in touch with me whenever I'm not streaming. Do give me a follow over on Twitter, twitter.com/Lord Rexworth. If you like this programming, you can support me directly with a donation via Stream Elements. The link is there in chat, streamelements.com/Lord Rexworth/tip. Our first sponsor tonight is Dubby. Now, what is Dubby, you might be asking? Well, it's an energy drink that you can mix at home with no jitters and no crash. Dubby has selected Neurofactor, a patented all-natural coffee cherry extract to help fuel you. This ingredient is what gives Dubby its laser focus and fast reflex effects, making it perfect for gamers. It's a formula worth bragging about. They've handpicked what they believe to be the 10 most critical ingredients for focus and concentration. Dubby contains important amino acids and vitamins that canned energy drinks simply do not have, and they deliver it at a cheaper price, only $1 per serving. You can't get a canned energy drink for that price anywhere. They also pay attention to what matters. Transparency is important with Dubby. Their labels disclose full ingredient amounts, and their products will never contain fillers or artificial colors or dyes. Dubby is also sugar-free, maltodextrin-free, and keto-friendly. Try Dubby today and stay hydrated and energized. Use the code LordRexworth at checkout for 10% off your order. Just go to dubby.gg and order online. Use the code LordRexworth at checkout for 10% off your order. Just click that link there in chat. Dubby, be better. Our newest sponsor tonight is NordVPN. If you're not using a reliable VPN, chat, your private information can be easily accessed by third parties. Get NordVPN to protect yourself from prying eyes. NordVPN encrypts your internet connection, hides your IP address and location, making you much safer, and you can enjoy more privacy online. All you have to do is purchase a subscription, download the NordVPN app, and then connect to a VPN server. It gives you the security you need, plus the features you'll love. You get things like uninterrupted streaming. You can watch your favorite content without any slowdown and interruption on all of your devices, wherever you are, with no limits on bandwidth or speed. You can start using NordVPN with just a few clicks. You get a plan, you sign up, you tap that quick connect button to pick the best server for your network conditions. You can connect to a VPN server and be sure NordVPN's cutting-edge A256 encryption keeps your online data safe, even on public Wi-Fi. Enjoy a higher level of security with NordVPN's threat protection feature. You can scan downloads from malware, block trackers, even hide ads. And rest assured, NordVPN does not collect or store your private information, such as used bandwidth, traffic logs, IP addresses, or browsing data. You can secure up to 6 devices on one account. Use NordVPN on all operating systems and browsers. Install NordVPN on your router and you can protect your home network. It's available for PC, it's available for Mac, it's available for iOS and Android devices, both your mobile phones and your tablets. Try NordVPN risk-free today for 30 days. Just click that link there in chat, use my affiliate link there, and try NordVPN risk-free for 30 days. We are also brought to you by Wise. Open your Wise account using that link there in the chat. Most people are running into the issue whenever they're on holiday, especially when they travel internationally, of hefty conversion fees and ATM charges when they travel. The Wise multi-currency account and debit card help to solve that problem. You can convert money before the trip at the mid-market exchange rate plus a small upfront fee. Then when you reach your travel destination, you can simply pay with your Wise debit card or withdraw at ATMs with free withdrawals up to $250 each month. And best of all, no foreign transaction fees. So when traveling abroad, consider Wise. With their multi-currency account and debit card, you can spend and withdraw money in over 40 currencies from local ATMs, much cheaper than using your local bank. Click that link there in the chat. Open your Wise account today. Wise up, nobles, with a little help from Wise. Finally, we are brought to you by the Cash App. Try the Cash App using my code, link in chat, and we'll both get $5 when you link a new bank account and send $5. Get $5 when you link your bank account and send $5 by clicking that link there in the chat with the Cash App available on iOS and Android devices. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into our reading ASMR. We're continuing with Follow the Saint. And this is called, the story is called The Affair of Hogsbottom. And we are now into Chapter 3. Simon lowered his spare foot to the carpet and bent his leg over it until he was down on one knee. From that position, he could peer through the keyhole and get a view of part of the room. Directly across from him, a thin, small, weasel-faced man stood over a radiogram beside the fireplace. A cigarette dangled limply from the corner of his mouth, and the eyes that squinted through the smoke drifting past his face were beady and emotionless like a snake's. Simon placed a lean, cruel face almost instantly in his encyclopedic mental records of the population of the underworld, and the recognition walloped into his already tottering awareness to register yet another item in the sequence of surprise punches that his phenomenal resilience was trying to stand up to. The weasel-faced man's name was Morris Dolph, and he was certainly no kind of guest for anyone with a reputation of Ebenezer Hogsbottom to entertain. The saint's survey slid off him onto the man who sat in front of the fireplace. This was someone whom the saint did not recognize, and he knew he was not Mr. Hogsbottom. He was a man with thin, sandy hair and a soft, plump face that would have fitted very nicely on someone's pet rabbit. At the moment, it was a very frightened rabbit. The man sat in a stiff-backed chair, placed on the hearthrug, and pieces of clothesline had been used to keep him there. His arms had been stretched around behind him and tied at the back of the chair so that his shoulders were hunched slightly forward by the strain. His shirt had been ripped open to the waist so that his chest was bare, and his skin was very white and insipid, as if it had never seen daylight since he was born. It It was so white that two irregular patches of inflammation on it stood out like blotches of dull red paint. His lips were trembling, and his eyes bulged in wide orbs of dread. "Oh, I don't know," he blubbered. "I tell you, you're making a mistake. I don't know anything about it. I haven't got it. Don't burn me again." Morris Dolph might not have heard. He stood leaning boredly against the radiogram and didn't move. Someone else did. It was a third man, whose back was turned to the door. The back was broad and fitted tightly into his coat, so the material wrinkled at the armpits, and the neck above it was short and thick and reddish, running quickly into close-cropped, wiry black hair. The whole rear view had a hard, coarse physical ruthlessness that made it unnecessary to see its owner's face to make an immediate summary of his character. It belonged without a shadow of a doubt to the thick, brutal voice that Simon had heard first, and equally without doubt, it could not possibly have belonged to Mr. Ebenezer Hoggsbottom. The same voice spoke again. It said, "Okay, Verdian, but you're the one who made the mistake. You made it when you thought you'd be smart and try to double-cross us. You made it worse when you tried to turn us into the cops, so we could take the rap for you and leave you with nothing to worry about. Now you're going to wish you hadn't been so damn smart." The broad back moved forward and bent towards the fireplace. The gas fire was burning in the grate. Although the evening was warm, and all at once the saint understood why he had heard, through the music, those screechy ululations which no orchestral instrument could have produced. The man with the broad back straightened up again, and its powerful hand was holding an ordinary kitchen ladle, of which the bowl glowed bright crimson. "You'll have it just how you like, rat," he said. "I don't mind how long you hold out. I'm going to enjoy working on you. I'm going to burn your body a bit more for a start. Then we'll take your shoes and socks off and put your feet in the fire and see how you like that. You can scream your head off if you want to, but nobody will hear you over the gramophone. Let's have some more of that loud stuff, Morty." Morris Dolph turned back to the radiogram without a flicker of expression and moved the pickup arm. The ride of the Valkyries crashed out again with a fearful vigor that would have drowned anything less than the howl of a hurricane, and the broad back shifted towards the man in the chair. The man in the chair stared in delirious horror from the glowing ladle to the face of the man who held it. His eyes bugged until there were white rims all round the pupils. His quivering lips fluttered into absurd, jerky patterns, pouring out frantic pleas and protestations that the music swamped into inaudibility. Simon Templar removed his eye from the keyhole and loosened the gun under his arm. He had no fanciful ideas about rushing to the rescue of a hapless victim of persecution. In fact, all the more subtle aspects of the victim looked as guilty as hell to him, if not of the actual double-crossing that seemed to be under discussion, at least of plenty of other reprehensible things. No entirely innocent householder would behave in exactly that way if he were being tortured by a couple of invading thugs. And the whole argument, as Simon had overheard it, smelled ripely with the rich fragrance of dishonor and dissension among thieves, which was an odor that had perfumed some of the most joyous hours of the saint's rapscallion life. By all the portents, he was still a puzzlingly long way from getting within kicking distance of the elusive Mr. Hoggsbottom, but here, under his very nose, was a proposition that looked no less diverting and a lot more mysterious, and the saint had a sublimely happy-go-lucky adaptability to the generous vagaries of fate. He took his gun clear out of the spring harness where he carried it, and opened the door. He went in without any stealth, which would have been entirely superfluous. The operatic pandemonium would have made his entrance mouse-like if he had ridden in on a capering elephant. He walked almost nonchalantly across the room, and its occupants were so taken up with their own business that he was within a couple of yards of them before any of them noticed he was there. Morris Dolph saw him first. His beady eyes swiveled incuriously towards the movement that must have finally caught the fringes of their range of vision, and became petrified into glassy blankness as they fastened on the saint's tall figure. His jaw dropped so that the cigarette would have fallen out of his mouth if the adhesive dampness of the paper had kept it hanging from his lower lip. He stood as horripilantly still as if a long icy needle had shot up out of the floor and impaled him from sacrum to occiput. That glazed paralysis lasted for about a breath and a half, and then his right hand whipped towards his pocket. It was nothing but an involuntary piece of sheer stupidity born out of shock. and the saint was benevolent enough to treat it that way. He simply lifted the gun in his hand a little, bringing it more prominently into view, and Dolph stopped himself in time. The man with the beefy neck in turn must have got some queer impression from Dolph's peculiar movements out of the corner of his eye. He turned and looked at his companion's face, froze for an instant, and then went on turning more quickly, straightening as he did so. He let go of the red-hot ladle, and his right hand started to make the same instinctive grab that Dolph had started, and stopped in midair for the same reason. His heavy, florid features seemed to bunch into knots of strangulated viciousness as he stood glowing numbly at the saint's masked face. Hello, Rexy. Woke up, unfortunately. I wanted to come see how everything's going. Well, welcome in, Bon. Good to see you. Simon stepped sideways toward the blaring radiogram and lifted the needle off the record. The nerve-rasping bombardment of sound broke off into blissful silence. That's better, he murmured relievedly. Now, can we all talk to each other without giving ourselves laryngitis? When did you discover this passion for expensive music, Morty? Morris Dolph's eyes blinked once at the jar being addressed by name, but he seemed to find it hard to work up an enthusiasm for discussing his cultural deployment. His tongue slid over his dry lips without forming an answering syllable. Simon turned to the big, florid man. Now that he had seen his face, he had identified him as well. Judd Caskin, I believe, he drawled with the delicate suavity of an ambassador of the old regime. Do you know that you're burning the carpet? Caskin looked at the fallen ladle. He bent and picked it up, rubbing the sole of his shoe over the smouldering patch of rug. Then, as if he suddenly realized that he had done all of that in mechanical obedience to a command that the saint had not even troubled to utter directly, he threw it clattering into the fireplace and turned his savage scowl back to the saint. What the hell do you want? He snarled. You know, I was just going to ask you the same question, Simon remarked mildly. It seemed to me that you were feeling your oats a bit, Judd. I suppose you get that way after doing 5 years on the moor, but you haven't been much more than 3 months, have you? You shouldn't be in such a hurry to go back. The big man's eyes gave the same automatic reaction as Dolph's had given to the accuracy of the saint's information, and hardened again into slits of unyielding suspicion. Who the hell are you? He grated slowly. You aren't a cop. Take that rag off your face, let's see who you are. When I'm ready, said the saint coolly, and then you may wish I hadn't. Just now, I'm asking the questions. What's this double-cross you're trying to find out about from Comrade Verdine? There was a silence. Morris Dolph's slight expression was fading out again. His mouth closed, and he readjusted his cigarette. Simon knew that behind that silent, hollow-cheeked mask, a cunning brain was getting back to work. Caskin's face, when he wanted to play tricks with it, could put on a ruddy, rough diamond joviality that was convincing enough to deceive most people who did not know too much about his criminal record. But at this moment, he was making no effort to put on his stock disguise. His mouth was buttoned up in an ugly, downturned curve. Why don't you find out if you're so wise? I could do that, said the saint. He moved on the arc of a circle towards Verdine's chair, keeping Dolph and Caskin covered all the time. His left hand dipped into his coat pocket and took out a penknife. He opened it one-handed, bracing it against his leg, and felt round to cut the cords from Verdine's wrists and ankles without shifting his eyes for an instant from the two men at the under end of his gun. We can go on with the concert, he explained gently, and I'm sure Comrade Verdine would enjoy having a turn as master of ceremonies. Put the spoon back in the fire, Verdine. Let's see how Comrade Caskin likes his chops broiled. Verdine stood up slowly and didn't move any further. His gaze wavered idiotically over the saint, as if he was too dazed to make up his mind what he ought to do. He pawed at his burnt chest and made helpless whimpering noises in his throat like a sick child. As Caskin glanced at him for a moment and slowly brought his eyes back to the saint again. At the time, Simon thought it was Verdine's obvious futility that kindled the stiffening, belligerent defiance in Caskin's stare. There was something almost like tentative domination in it. Caskin sneered. See if he'll do it. He wouldn't have the guts. And you can't. Well, you've got to keep that gun on us. I'm not soft enough to fall for that sort of bluff. You picked the wrong show to butt in on, however you got here. You better get out again in a hurry before you get hurt. And you better put that gun away and go home and forget you ever came here. And another voice said, or you can freeze right where you are. Don't try to move, or I'll let you have it. The saint froze. The voice was very close behind him, too close to take any chances with. He could have flattened Caskin before it could carry out its threat, but that was as far as he would get. The saint had a cold-blooded way of estimating his chances in any situation, and he was much too interested in life just then to make that kind of trade. He knew now the real reason for Caskin's sudden gathering of confidence, and why the big man had talked so fast in a strain that couldn't help centering his attention. Caskin had taken his opportunity well. Not a muscle of his face had betrayed what he was seeing, and his loud bullying voice had effectively covered any slight noise that the girl might have made as she crept up. The girl. Yes. Simon Templar's most lasting startlement clung to the fact that the voice behind him unmistakably belonged to a girl. Chapter 4. "Drop that gun," she said, "and be quick about it." Simon dropped it. His ears were nicely attuned to the depth of meaning behind a voice, and this voice meant what it said. His automatic plunked on the carpet, and modest Dolph stooped into the scene and snatched it up. Even then, Dolph said nothing. He propped himself back on the radiogram and kept the gun leveled, watching Simon in silence with sinister lizard eyes. He was one of the least talkative men that Simon had ever seen. "Keep him covered," Caskin said unnecessarily. "We'll see what he looks like." He stepped forward and jerked the handkerchief down from the saint's face. And then there was a stillness that prolonged itself through a gamut of emotions, which would have looked like the most awful kind of ham acting if they had been faithfully recorded on celluloid. Neither Dolph nor Caskin had ever met the saint personally, but his photograph had at various times been published in almost every newspaper on Earth, and verbal descriptions of him had circulated through underworld channels so often that they must have worn a private groove for themselves. Admittedly, there were still considerable numbers of malefactors to whom the saint was no more than a dreaded name, but Messrs. Dolph and Caskin were not among them. Recognition came to them slowly, which accounted for the elaborate and long-drawn detail of their changing expressions, but it came with a frightful certainty. Modest Dolph's fleshless visage seemed to grow thinner and meaner, and his fingers twitched hungrily around the butt of Simon's gun. Judd Caskin's sanguine complexion changed color for a moment, and then his mouth twisted as though tasting its own venom. "Saint," he said hoarsely. "I told you might be sorry," said the saint. He smiled at them pleasantly, as if nothing had happened to disturb his poise, since he was holding the only weapon in sight. It was a smile that would have tightened a quality of desperation into the vigilance of certain criminals who knew him better than Dolph and Caskin did. It was the kind of smile that only touched the saint's lips when the odds against him were most hopeless, and when all the reckless fighting vitality that had written the chapter headings in his charmed saga of adventure was blithely preparing to thumb its nose at them. Then he turned and looked at the girl. She was blonde and blue-eyed, with a small face like a very pretty baby doll. But the impression of vapid immaturity was contradicted by her mouth. Her mouth had character. Not all of it very good by conventional standards, but the kind of character that has an upsetting effect on many conventional men. It was a rather large mouth with a sultry lower lip that seemed to have been fashioned for the express purpose of reviving the maximum amount of the old Adam in any masculine observer. The rest of her, he noticed, carried out the theme summarized in her mouth. Her light dress molded itself to her figure, with a snugness that vouched for the fragility of her underwear, and the curves that it suggested were stimulating to the worst kind of imagination. "Angela," said the saint genially, "you're looking very well for your age. I ought to have remembered that Judd always worked with a woman, but I didn't think you'd have one with him on a job like this. I suppose you were sitting in the car outside, saw me arrive." "You know everything, don't you?" Caskin gibed. He was recovering from the first shock of finding out whom he had captured, and the return of his self-assurance was an ugly thing. "Only one thing puzzles me," said the saint equably, "and that is why they sent you to Dartmoor instead of putting you in the zoo. Or did the ISPCA object on behalf of the other animals?" "You're smart," Caskin said lividly. His ugliness had a hint of bluster in it that was born of fear, a fear that the legends about the saint were capable of inspiring. even when he was apparently disarmed and helpless. But the ugliness was no less dangerous for that reason. Perhaps it was more dangerous. You're smart like Verdine, Caskin said. You saw what he got. I'm asking the questions again now, and I'll burn you the same way if you don't answer, and I'll burn you twice as much if you make any more funny answers. Now do your talking, smart guy. How'd you get in here? I flew in, said the saint, with my little wings. Caskin drew back his fist. Wait a minute, said the girl impatiently. He had another man with him. Caskin almost failed to hear her. His face was contorted with the blind rage into which men of his type are fatally easy to tease. His fist traveled 2 inches before he stopped it. The girl's meaning worked itself into his intelligence by visibly slow degrees, as if it had to penetrate layers of gum. He turned his head stiffly. What's that? There were 2 of them. I saw them. Then where's the other one? Caskin said stupidly. Simon was asking himself the same question, but he had more data to go on. He had left the kitchen door open and also left the living room door open behind him when he came in. The girl had come in through the door without touching it, and she must have entered the house at the front, or she would have met Hoppy before. The chances were, therefore, that Hoppy had heard most of the conversation since the music stopped. But with the living room door still open, and 3 of the ungodly in the room facing in different directions, it would be difficult for him to show himself and go into action without increasing the saint's danger. He must have been standing in the hall by that time, just out of sight round the edge of the doorway, waiting for Simon to make him an opening. At least, Simon hoped he was. He had to gamble on it, for he was never likely to get a better break. Lucy, welcome in. Thank you for the lurks. Caskin swung back on him to repeat the question in a lower key. Where's your pal, smart guy? You haven't looked at the window lately, have you? Said the saint blandly. Any other time it might not have worked, but this time the ungodly were at a disadvantage, because one of their own number had brought up the subject. They had another disadvantage because they did not realize until a second later that the room contained more than one window, and their third misfortune was that they all gave way simultaneously to a natural instinct of self-preservation that the saint's indescribably effortless serenity did everything in its power to encourage. All of them looked different ways at once, while all of them must have assumed that somebody else was continuing to watch the saint, which provided a beautiful example of one of those occasions when unanimity is not strength. Caskin was nearly between Simon and the girl, and the saint's swift sidestep perfected the alignment. The saint's right foot drove at the big man's belt buckle, sent Caskin staggering back against her. She was caught flat-footed and started moving too late to dodge him. They collided with a thump, but Caskin's momentum was too great to be completely absorbed by the impact. They reeled back together, Caskin's flailing arms nullifying the girl's desperate effort to regain her balance. The small nickeled automatic waved wildly in her hand. Simon didn't wait to see how the waltz had worked out. He had only a matter of split seconds to play with, and they had to be crowded ones. He was pivoting on his left foot, with his right leg still in the air, even as Caskin started caroming backwards from the kick. And Morris Dolph was a fraction of an instant slow in sorting out the situation. The saint's left hand grabbed his automatic around the barrel before the trigger could tighten, twisting it sideways out of line. It exploded once, harmlessly, and then the saint's right fist slammed squarely on the weasel-faced man's thin nose. Morris Dolph's eyes bleared with agony, and his fingers went limp with the stunning pain. Simon wrenched the gun away and reversed the butt swiftly into his right hand. The saint spun round. Hoppy's chunky outline loomed in the doorway, his massive automatic questing for a target, a pleased warrior smile splitting the lower half of his face. But Caskin was finding solid ground under his feet again, and his right hand was struggling with his hip pocket. The girl's nickel-plated toy was coming back to aim, and behind him, the saint knew that Morris Dolph was getting out another gun. Simon had only taken back the automatic he had lost a short while earlier. Morris Dolph still had his own gun. The saint felt goose pimples rising all over him. "The lights, Hoppy!" he yelled, "and scram at the front!" He dived sideways as he spoke, and darkness engulfed the room mercifully as he did it. Cordite barked malignantly out of the blackness, licking hot orange tongues at him from 2 directions. He heard the hiss and smack of lead, but it did not touch him. And then his dive cannoned him into the man called Verdine. It was Verdine that he had meant to reach. His instinct had mapped the campaign with a speed and sureness that deliberate logic still had to catch up with, but all the steps were there. The atmosphere of the moment showed no probability of simmering down into that mellow tranquility in which heart-to-heart talks are exchanged. The saint very much wanted a heart-to-heart talk with somebody, if only to satisfy a perfectly normal inquisitiveness concerning what all the commotion was about. But since Messrs. Dolph and Caskin had been asking the questions when he arrived, it appeared that Mr. Verdine might know more of the answers than they did. Therefore, Mr. Verdine looked like the prize catch of the evening. Therefore, Mr. Verdine had to be transported to an atmosphere where heart-to-heart talking might take place. It was as simple as that. The saint gripped Verdine by the arm and said, "Let's go somewhere else, brother. Your friends are getting rough." Verdine took one step the way the saint steered him, and then he turned into a convincing impersonation of an hysterical eel. He squirmed against the saint's grasp with the strength of panic, and his free arm whirled frantically in the air. His knuckles hit the saint's cheekbone near the eye, sending a shower of sparks across Simon's vision. Simon might have stopped to reason with him, to persuasively point out the manifest arguments in favor of adjourning to a less hectic neighborhood, but he had no time. No more shots had been fired, doubtless because it had been borne in upon by the ungodly that they stood a 2-to-1 chance of doing more damage to each other than to him, but he could hear them blundering in search of him. The saint raised his gun and brought the barrel down vigorously where he thought Verdine's head ought to be. Mr. Verdine's head proved to be in the desired spot, and Simon ducked a shoulder under him and lifted him up as he collapsed. The actual delay amounted to less than 3 seconds. The ungodly were still blinded by the dark, but Simon launched himself at the window with the accuracy of a homing pigeon. He wasted no time fumbling with catches. He hit the center of it with his shoulder, the shoulder over which Verdine was draped. Verdine, in turn, hit it with his hams, and the fastening was not equal to the combined load. It splintered away with a sharp crack, and the twin casements flew open crashingly. Verdine passed through them into the night, landing in soft earth with a soggy thud, and the saint went on after him as if he were plunging into a pool. He struck ground with his hands and rolled over in a fairly graceful somersault as a fourth shot banged out of the room he had just left. A gorilla paw caught him under the arm and helped him up, and Mr. Onias's voice croaked anxiously in his ear. "You ain't stopped anything, boss." "No," Simon grinned in the dark. "They aren't that good. Grab hold of this bird and see if the car will start. They probably left the keys in it." He had located Mr. Verdine lying where he had fallen. Simon raised him by the slack of his coat and slung him into Hoppy's bear-like clutch, and turned back towards the window just as the lights of the living room went on again behind the disordered curtains. He crouched in the shadow of a bush with his gun raised and said in a much more carrying voice, "I bet I can shoot my initials on the face of the first guy who sticks his nose outside." The lights went out a second time, and there was considerable silence. The house might have been empty of life. Behind him, Simon heard an engine whine to life, drop back to a subdued purr as the starter disconnected. He backed towards the car, his eyes raking the house frontage relentlessly until he could step onto the running board. "Okay, Hoppy," he said. The black sedan slid forward. Another shot whacked out behind as he opened the door and tumbled into the front seat, but it was yards wide of usefulness. The headlights sprang into brilliance as they lurched through an opening ahead and skidded round in the lane beyond. For the first time in several overcrowded minutes, the saint had leisure to get out his cigarette case. The flame of his lighter painted jubilantly Mephistophelian highlights on his face. "Let's pick up our own car," he said. "Then we'll take our prize home and find out what we've won." He found out sooner than that. He only had to fish out Mr. Verdine's wallet to find a half-dozen engraved cards that answered a whole tumult of questions with staggering simplicity. They said, "Mr. Robert Verdine, Branch Manager, City and Continental Bank Limited, Staines." Chapter 5. Patricia Home put 2 lumps of sugar in her coffee and stirred it. "Well, that's your story," she said coldly, "so I suppose you're sticking to it. But what were you doing there in the first place?" "I told you," said the saint, "we were looking for Hogsbottom." "Why should you be looking for him?" "Because he annoyed me, you remember, and we had to do something to pass the evening." "You could have gone to the cinema. What, and seen a picture about gangsters?" You know what a demoralizing influence these pictures have. Might have put ideas into my head. Of course, she said. And you didn't have any ideas about Hogsbottom? Nothing very definite, he admitted. We might have just wedged his mouth open and poured him full of gin and then pushed him in the stage door of a leg show or something like that. Anyway, it didn't come to anything. We got to the wrong house, as you may have gathered. The bloke who told us the way said the fourth house, but it was too dark to see houses. I was counting entrances, but I didn't discover until afterwards that Verdine's place has one of those U-shaped drives with an in and out gate, so I counted him twice. Hogsbottom's sty must have been the next house on. Verdine's house is called the Shutters, but the paint was so bad that I easily took it for the Snuggery. After I'd made the mistake and got in there, I was more or less a pawn on the chessboard of chance. There was obviously something about Verdine that wanted investigating, and the way things panned out, it didn't look healthy to investigate him on the spot, so we just had to bring him away with us. You didn't have to hit him so hard that he'd get concussion and lose his memory. Simon rubbed his chin. Well, there's certainly something in that, darling, but it was all very difficult. It was too dark for me to see just what I was doing, and I was in rather a rush. However, it does turn out to be a bit of a snag. He had discovered the calamity the night before after he had unloaded Verdine at his country house in Weybridge. He'd chosen that secluded lair as a destination partly because it was only about 5 miles from Chertsey, partly because it had more elaborate facilities for concealing captives than his London apartment. The bank manager had taken an alarmingly long time to recover consciousness, and when he eventually came back to life, it was only to vomit and moan unintelligibly. In between retchings, his eyes wandered over his surroundings with a vacant stare, into which even the use of his own name and the reminders of the plight from which he had been extricated could not bring a single flicker of response. Simon had dosed him with calomel and sedatives and put him to bed, hoping that he would be back to normal in the morning, but he had awakened in very little better condition, clutching his head painfully and mumbling nothing but listless, uncomprehending replies to any question he was asked. He was still in bed, giving no trouble but serving absolutely no useful purpose as a source of information, and the saint gazed out the window at the morning sunlight, lancing through the birch and pine glade outside, and frowned ruefully over the consummate irony of the impasse. "I might have known there'd be something like this waiting for me when you phoned me to come down for breakfast," said Patricia stoically. "How soon were you expecting Teal?" The saint chuckled. "He'll probably be sizzling in much sooner than we want him. A tangle like this wouldn't be complete without good old Claude Eustace, but we'll worry about that when that happens. Meanwhile, I've got one consolation. Comrade Verdine seems to be one of those birds who stuff everything in their pockets until the stitches begin to burst. I've been going over his collection of junk again, and it tells quite a story from when you put it together. Half the breakfast table was taken up with a potpourri of relics which he had extracted from various parts of the bank manager's clothing, now sorted out into neat piles. Simon waved a spoon at them. Look them over for yourself, Pat. Notice to you, you've got a couple of interesting souvenirs. Hotel bills. One of them is where Mr. Robert Verdine stayed in a modest semi-boarding house at Eastbourne for the first 10 days of July. The other one follows straight on for the next 5 days, only it's from a swank Sin Palace in Brighton, and covers a sojourn of a Mr. and Mrs. Jones who seem to have consumed a large amount of champagne during their stay. If you had a low mind like mine, you might begin to jump to a few conclusions about Comrade Verdine's last vacation. I could get ideas. Then there's the feminine handkerchief, a pretty little sentimental souvenir, but rather compromising." Patricia picked it up and sniffed it. Night of Sin," she said with a slight grimace. "Oh, is that what it's called? I wouldn't know. But I do know that it's the same smell that the blonde floozy brought in with her last night. Her name is Angela Lindsay, and she has quite a reputation in the trade for having made suckers out of a lot of men who should have been smarter than Comrade Verdine." She nodded. "What about the big stack of letters? Are they love letters?" "Not exactly. They're bookmakers' accounts, and the little book on top of them isn't just a heartthrob diary. It's a betting diary. The name on all of them is Joseph McIntyre. And you'll remember from an old adventure of ours that Comrade McIntyre has what you might call an elastic conscience about his bookmaking. The story is all there, figured down to pennies. Verdine seems to have started on the 6th of July, and he went off with a bang. But middle of the month, he must have wondered why he ever bothered to work in a bank. Not surprised he had champagne every night at Brighton. It was all free. But the luck started to change after that. He had fewer and fewer winners, and he went on plunging more and more heavily. The last entry in the diary, a fortnight ago, left him nearly £5,000 in the red. Your first name doesn't have to be Sherlock to put all those notes together and make a tune. Patricia's sweet face was solemn with thought. Those two men, she said, Dolph and Caskin, you knew them. What's their racket? Morty was one of Snake Ganning's spare-time boys once. He's quite dangerous, quite the sadist in his nasty little way. You could hire him for anything up to murder at a price, but he really enjoys his work. Caskin has more brains, though. He's more versatile. Confidence work, the old badger game, living off women, protection rackets. He's had a dab at all of them. He's worked around racetracks quite a bit too, doping horses, intimidating jockeys and bookmakers and so forth, which makes him an easy link with McIntyre. His last stretch was for manslaughter, but bank robbery is quite a fancy flight even for him. He must have been getting ideas. Patricia's eyes turned slowly towards the morning paper, in which the hold-up at Staines still had a place in the headlines. You mean you think? I think our guardian angel is still trying to take care of us, said the saint, and all the old impertinent mischief that she knew too well was shimmering at the edges of his smile. If only we knew a cure for amnesia, I think we could be £15,000 richer before bedtime. Add it up for yourself, or I take another look at the patient. He got up from the table and went through to the study, which adjoined the dining room. It was a rather small, comfortably untidy room, and the greater part of its walls were lined with built-in bookshelves. When he went in, one tier of shelving about 2 feet wide stood open like a door. Beyond it, there appeared to be a narrow passage. The passage was actually a tiny cell, artificially lighted and windowless, but perfectly ventilated through a grating that connected with the air conditioning system which served the rest of the house. The cell was no more than a broad gap between the solid walls of the rooms on either side of it, so ingeniously squeezed into the architecture of the house that it would have taken a clear surveyor many hours of work with a foot rule to discover its existence. It had very little more than enough room for the cot in which Verdine lay, and the table and chair at which Hoppy Oniats was dawdling over his breakfast, if any meal which ended after noon and was washed down with a bottle of Scotch whisky could get by with that name. Simon stood just inside with the opening and glanced over the scene. Any luck yet? He asked. Mr. Oniats shook his head. The guy's cuckoo, boss. They've tried to give him a drink and he don't want it. Throws it up like it might be a poison. He mentioned this with the weighty reluctance of a psychiatrist, adducing the ultimate evidence of dementia praecox. Simon squeezed his way through and slipped a thermometer into the patient's mouth. He held Verdine's wrist with sensitive fingers. Don't you want to get up, Mr. Verdine? The bank manager gazed at him expressionlessly. You don't want to be late at the bank, do you? Said the saint. You might lose your job. What bank? Verdine asked. You know, the one that was robbed. I don't know. Where am I? You're safe now. Caskin's looking for you, but he won't find you. Caskin, Vernon repeated. His face was blank, idiotic. Is he someone I know? You remember Angela, don't you? Said the saint. She wants to see you. Verdine rolled his head on the pillow. I don't know. Who are all these people? I don't want to see anyone. My head's splitting. I want to go to sleep. His eyes closed under painfully wrinkled brows. Simon let his wrist fall. He took out the thermometer, read it, then sidled back to the door. Patricia was standing there. No change, she said, and the saint shrugged. His temperature's practically normal, but his pulse is high. God alone knows how long it may take him to get his memory back. He could stay like this for a week, might even be years. Never can tell. I'm beginning to think I may have been a bit too hasty with my rescuing hero act. I ought to have let Caskin and Dolph work him over a bit longer. Heard what he had to tell them before I butted in. Patricia shook her head. You know you couldn't have done that. I know. The saint made a wryly philosophic face. That's the worst of trying to be a buccaneer with a better nature. But you've saved a hell of a lot of trouble just the same. As it is, even if he does recover his memory, we're going to have to do something exciting ourselves to make him open up. Now, if only we could swat him on the head in the opposite direction and knock his memory back again. He broke off abruptly, his eyes fixed intently on the corner of a room. But Patricia knew he was not seeing it. She looked at him with an involuntary tightening in her chest. Her ears had not been quick enough to catch the first swish of tires on the gravel drive, which had cut off what he was saying, but she was able to hear the car outside coming to a stop. The saint did not move. He seemed to be waiting, like a watchdog holding its bark while it tried to identify a stray sound that had pricked its ears. In another moment, She knew what he had been waiting for. The unmistakable, limping steps of Oris, Simon Templar's oldest and most devoted retainer, came through the hall from the direction of the kitchen and paused outside the study. "Is that their detective, ain't it, sir?" he said in a fierce whisper. "I seen him through the window." "Shall I chuck him in, eh?" "No, let him in," said the saint quietly, "but give me a couple of seconds first." He drew Patricia quickly out of the secret cell and closed the study door. His lips were flirting with the wraith of a saintly smile, and only Patricia would have seen the steel in his blue eyes. "What a prophet you are, darling," he said. He swung the open strip of bookcase back into place. It closed silently on delicately balanced hinges, filling the aperture in the wall without a visible crack. He moved one of the shelves to lock it. Then he closed a drawer of his desk which had been left open, and there was the faint click of another lock taking hold. Only then did he open the door to the hall and left it open. And with that, a master lock, electrically operated, took control. Even with the knowledge of the other two operations, nothing short of pickaxes and dynamite could open the secret room when the study door was open, and one of the saint's best bets was that no one who was searching the house would be likely to make a point of shutting it. He emerged into the hall just as Chief Inspector Teal's official boots stomped wrathfully over the threshold. The detective saw him as soon as he appeared, and the heightened color on his chubby face flared up with a perilous surge of his blood pressure. He took a lurching step forward, with one quivering forefinger thrust out ahead of him like a spear. "You, Saint," he bellowed. "I want you." The Saint smiled at him, carefree and incredibly debonair. "Why, hello, Claude O'Gumboyle," he murmured genially. "You seem to be excited about something. Come in and tell me all about it." Chapter 6. Simon Templar had never actually been followed into his living room by an irate mastodon, but if that remarkable experience was ever to befall him in the future, he would have had an excellent standard by which to compare it. The imitation, as rendered by Chief Inspector Claude Eustace Teal, was an impressive performance, but it seemed to leave the saint singularly unconcerned. He waved towards one armchair and deposited himself in another, reaching for the cigarette box and ashtray. "Make yourself at home," he invited affably. "Things have been pretty dull lately, as I said last night. What can I do to help you?" Mr. Teal gritted his teeth over a lump of chewing gum with a barbarity which suggested that he found it an invidious substitute for the saint's jugular vein. Why he should have followed the saint at all in the first place was a belated question that was doing nothing to improve his temper. He could find no more satisfactory explanation than that the saint had simply turned and calmly led the way, and he could hardly be expected to go on talking to an empty hall. But in the act of following, he felt that he had already lost a subtle point. It was one of those smoothly infuriating tricks of the saint to put him at a disadvantage which never failed to lash Mr. Teal's unstable temper to the point where he felt as if he were being garroted with his own collar. And on this occasion, out of all others, he must control himself. He had no need to get angry. He held all the aces. He had everything that he had prayed for in the long sections of his career that had been consecrated to the heartbreaking task of trying to lay the saint by the heels. He must not make any mistakes. He must not let himself be baited into any more of these unbelievable indiscretions that had wrecked such opportunities in the past, and that made him sweat all over as soon as he had escaped from the saint's maddening presence. He told himself so over and over again, clinging to all the tatters of his self-restraint with the doggedness of a drowning man. He glared at the saint with an effort of impassivity that made the muscles of his face ache. "You can help me by taking a trip to the police station with me," he said. "Before you go any further, it's my duty to warn you you're under arrest. All the evidence I need to keep you there." "Of course you have, Claude," said the saint soothingly. "Haven't you had it every time you've arrested me? But now you've got that off your chest, would it be frightfully tactless if I asked you what I'm supposed to have done?" "Last night," Teal said, grinding his words out under fearful compression, "a Mr. Robert Verdine, manager of the City and Continental Bank's branch at Staines, was visited at his home in Chertsey by two men. They tied up a servant at the kitchen, went on to find him in the living room. The maid's description of them makes them sound like two men who held up the same bank that morning. They went into the living room, turned on the radio. How very odd, said the Saint. I suppose they were trying to console Comrade Verdine for having his bank robbed. Has that got to do with me, or do you think I was one of them? Shortly afterwards, Teal went on, ignoring the interruption, 2 other men entered the kitchen with handkerchiefs tied over their faces. One of them was about your height and build. The maid heard this one address the other one as Hoppy. Simon nodded perfunctorily. Yes, he said, and then his eyebrows rose. My God, Claude, that's funny. Of course, you're thinking that American gangster who follows you around is called Hoppy, isn't he? If you're referring to Mr. Uniat, said the Saint stiffly, he's sometimes called that, but he hasn't got any copyright in the name. The detective took a fresh nutcracker purchase on his gum. Perhaps he hasn't, but the tall one went into the living room. The radio was switched off and on again, and then it stayed off. So the maid heard quite a bit of the conversation. She heard people talking about the Saint. That's one of the penalties of fame, said the Saint sadly. People are always talking about me in the weirdest places. It's quite embarrassing sometimes, but do go on telling me about it. Mr. Teal's lead ink suffered a spasm which interfered momentarily with his power of speech. That's all I have to tell you, he yelped when he had partially cleared the obstruction. I mean that you and that Uniat's creature of yours were the second 2 men who arrived. After that, according to the maid, there was a lot of shooting, and presently some neighbors arrived and untied her. All the 4 men who had been there disappeared, and so did Mr. Verdine. I want you on suspicion of kidnapping him, and if we don't find him soon, there'll probably be a charge of murder as well. Simon Templar frowned. His manner was sympathetic rather than disturbed. I know how you feel, Claude, he said commiseratingly. Naturally, you want to do something about it. And I know you're quite a miracle worker when you get going, but I wish I could figure out how you're going to tie me up with it when I wasn't anywhere near the place. The detective's glare reddened. You weren't anywhere near Chertsey, eh? So we've got to break down another of your famous alibis. All right, then, where were you? I was at home. Whose home? My own, this one. Yeah? Who else knows about it? Not a lot of people, Simon confessed. We've been quiet, one of those restful, old-fashioned fireside evenings. If it comes to that, I suppose there isn't an army of witnesses. You can't have a quiet, restful evening with an army of witnesses covering up the place. It's a contradiction in terms. There was just Pat and Hoppy and, of course, good old Otis. Pat and Hoppy and Otis, jeered the detective. Just a quiet, restful evening, and that's your alibi. Well, I wouldn't say it was entirely my alibi, Simon mentioned diffidently. After all, there are several other houses in England, and I wouldn't mind betting that in at least half of them, various people were having quiet, restful evenings last night. Why don't you go and ask some of them whether they can prove it? Because you know that being a lot less tolerant and forbearing than I am, they'd only tell you to go back to Scotland Yard and sit on a radiator until you thawed some of the clotted suet out of your brains. How the hell would you expect anyone to prove he'd spent a quiet evening at home? By bringing in a convocation of bishops for witnesses? In a case like this, it isn't the suspect's job to prove he was home. It's your job to prove he wasn't. Chief Inspector Teal should have been warned. The ghosts of so many other episodes like this should have risen up to give him caution. But they didn't. Instead, they egged him on. He leaned forward in a glow of vindictive exultation. That's just what I'm going to do, he said, and his voice grew rich with the lusciousness of his own triumph. We aren't always so stupid as you think we are. We found fresh tire tracks in the drive, and they did not belong to Verdine's car. We searched every scrap of ground for half a mile to see if we could pick them up again. We found them turning into a field quite close to the end of Greenleaf Road. The car that made them was still in the field. It was reported stolen in Windsor early yesterday morning. But there were tracks of another car in the field, overlapping and underlapping the tracks of the stolen car, so that we know the kidnappers changed into another car for their getaway. I've got casts of those tracks, and I'm going to show you that they match the tires on your car. It's Biku. Thank you so much for the follow. The Saint blinked. It would certainly be rather awkward if they did, he said uneasily. I didn't give anybody permission to bother my car last night. But of course, somebody might have taken it away and brought it back without your knowing it, Teal said with guttural sarcasm. Oh, yes. His voice suddenly went into a squeak. Well, I'm going to be in court to watch the jury laugh themselves sick when you try to tell that story. I'm going to examine your car now in front of police witnesses, and I'd like them to see your face when I do it. It was the detective's turn to march away and leave the Saint to follow. He had a moment of palpitation where he wondered whether the saint would do it. But as he flung open the front door and crunched into the drive, he heard the saint's footsteps behind him. The glow of triumph that was in him warmed like a Yule log on a Christmas hearth. The saint's expression had reverted to blandness quickly enough, but not so quickly that Teal had missed the guilty start which had broken through its smooth surface. He knew with a blind ecstasy that at long last the saint had tripped. He waved imperiously to the two officers in the prowl car outside and marched on toward the garage. The saint's hirondelle stood there in its glory, an engineering symphony in cream and red trimmed with chromium, with the more sedate black Daimler in which Patricia had driven down standing beside it. But Teal had no aesthetic admiration for the sight. He stood by like a pink-faced figure of doom, while his assistants reverently unwrapped the moulage impressions, and then, like a master chef taking charge of the vital moment in the preparation of a dish for which his underlings had laid the routine foundations, he took the costs in his own hands and proceeded to compare them with the tires on the Hirondelle. He went all around the Hirondelle twice. He was breathing a trifle laboriously, and his face was redder than before, probably from stooping, when he turned his attention to the Daimler. He went all around the Daimler twice, too. Then he straightened up and came slowly back to the saint. He came back until his face was only a few inches from the saint's. His capillaries were congested to the point where his complexion had a dark purple hue. He seemed to be having more trouble with his legs. "What have you done to those tires?" He got out in an hysterical blare. The saint's eyebrows drew perplexedly together. "What have I done to them? I don't get you, Claude. Do you mean to say they don't match?" "You know damn well they don't match. You knew it all the time." Realization of the way the saint had deliberately lured him up to greater heights of optimism, only to make his downfall more hideous when it came, brought something like a sob into the detective's gullet. "You've changed the tires." Simon looked aggrieved. "How could I, Claude? You can see for yourself these tires are a long way from being new." "What have you done with the tires you had on your car last night?" Teal almost screamed. "Well, these are the only tires I've had on the car for weeks," Simon protested innocently. "Why do you always suspect me of such horrible deceits? If my tires don't match the tracks you found in that field, it just looks to me as if you may have made a mistake about my being here." Chief Inspector Teal did a terrible thing. He raised the casts in his hands and hurled them down on the concrete floor so that they shattered into 1,000 fragments. He did not actually dance on them, but he looked as if only an effort of self-control that brought him to the brink of an apoplectic stroke stopped him from doing so. "What have you done with Verdine?" he yelled. "I haven't done anything with him. Why should I have? I never even set eyes on the man." "I've got a search warrant. Then why don't you search?" demanded the saint snappily, as though his patience was coming to an end. "You won't believe anything I tell you anyhow, so why don't you look for yourself? Go ahead and use your warrant. Tear the house apart. I don't mind. I'll be waiting for you in the living room when you're ready to eat some of your words." He turned on his heel and strode back to the house. He sat down in the living room, lit a cigarette, and calmly picked up a magazine. He heard the tramp of Teal and his minions entering the front door without looking up. For an hour he listened to them moving about in various parts of the house, tapping walls, shifting furniture, but he seemed to have no interest beyond the story he was reading. Even when they invaded the living room itself, he didn't even glance at them. He went on turning the pages as if they made no more difference to his idleness than a trio of inquisitive puppies. Teal came to the living room last. Simon knew from the pregnant stillness that presently supervened that the search had come to a stultifying end, but he continued serenely to finish his page before he looked up. "Well," he said at length, "have you found him?" "Where is he?" shouted Teal, with dreadful savagery. Simon put down the magazine. "Look here," he said wearily, "I've made a lot of allowances for you, but I give up. What's the use? I tell you I was home last night, and you can't prove I wasn't. But just because you want me to have been out, I must be faking an alibi. You've got casts of tire tracks of a car that was mixed up in some dirty business last night, and they don't match the tracks of either of my cars, but just because you think they ought to match, I must have changed my tires. I tell you I haven't kidnapped this fellow Verdine, and you can't find him anywhere in my house, but just because you think I ought to have kidnapped him, I must have hidden him somewhere else. Every shred of evidence is against you, and therefore all the evidence must be wrong. You couldn't possibly be wrong yourself, because you're the great Chief Inspector Claude Eustace Teal, who knows everything and always gets his man. All right, Every bit of proof here shows that I'm innocent, but I must be guilty because your theories would be all wet if I wasn't. So why do we have to waste our time on silly little details like this? Let's just take me down to the police station and lock me up. That's just what I'm going to do, Teal raved blindly. The Saint looked at him for a moment and then stood up. Good enough, he said breezily. I'm ready when you are. He went to the door and called, Pat! She answered him, and she came down the stairs. Said, Darling, Claude Eustace has had an idea. He's going to lug me off and shove me in the cooler on a charge of being above suspicion. It's a new system they've introduced in Scotland Yard, and all the laws are being altered to suit it. So you better call one of your lawyers and see if he knows what to do about it. Oh, and you might ring up some of the newspapers while you're on the job. They'll probably want to interview Claude about his brainwave. Yes, of course, she said enthusiastically, and went towards the telephone in the study. Something awful, something terrifying, something freezing and paralyzing, damp, chilly, appalling descended over Chief Inspector Teal like a glacial cascade. With the very edge of the precipice crumbling under his toes, his eyes were opened. The delirium of fury that had swept him along so far coagulated sickeningly within him. Cold, pitiless, inescapable facts hammered their bitter way through into the turmoil of his brain. He was too shocked at the moment even to feel the anguish of despair. His mind shuddered under the impact of a new kind of panic. He took a frantic step forward, a step that was, in its own way, the crossing of a harrowing Rubicon. Wait a minute, he stammered hoarsely. Chapter 7. 15 minutes later, Simon Templar stood on the front steps and watched the police car crawl out of the drive with its cargo of incarnate woe. He felt Patricia's fingers slide into his hand and turned to smile at her. So far, so good, he said thoughtfully, but only so far. I thought you were joking at breakfast, she said. How did he get here so soon? He shrugged. Oh, that wasn't difficult. I suppose he stayed down at Staines last night and the Chertsey police would have phoned over about the Verdine business first thing this morning, knowing that he was the manager of the bank that had been held up. Claude must have shot off on the scent like a prize greyhound, and I'm afraid I can sympathize with the way he must have felt when he arrived here. Well, we're still alive, she said hopefully. You got rid of him again. Only because his nerves are getting a bit shaky from all the times I've slipped through his fingers, and he's so scared of being made a fool of again that he daren't move now without a cast-iron case. I was able to pick a few awkward holes in this one. But don't begin thinking we've got rid of him for keeps. He's just gone away now to see if he can stop up the holes again and put some more iron in the evidence. And he's sore enough to work overtime at it. He's going to be 3 times as dangerous from now on. Worse than that, he's not so dumb that he isn't going to put 2 and 2 together about all this commotion around Verdine coming right on top of the robbery. You can bet the crown jewels to a showgirl's virtue he's already figured out that Verdine was mixed up in it in some way. And while we're stuck with Verdine, and Verdine is stuck with amnesia, the Saint closed the front door with sombre finality, which is a hell of a layout from any angle, he said. Tell Otis to bring me a large mug of beer, darling. I think I'm going to have a headache. Ito Sagiri, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in. His headache lasted through a lunch, which Otis indignantly served even later than he had served breakfast, but it brought forth very, very little to justify itself. He had gone over the facts at his disposal until he was sick of them, and they fitted together with a complete and sharply focused deductive picture that Sherlock Holmes himself could not have improved on, without a hiatus or loose end anywhere. Only the picture merely showed up with a plump, rabbit-faced man slinking off with £15,000 in a bag, and neglected to show where he went with it, which was one detail in which Simon Templar was most urgently interested. He was always on the side of the angels, he told himself, but he had to remember that sanctity had its own overhead to meet. Verdine showed no improvement in the afternoon. Towards 5 o'clock the Saint had a flash of inspiration and put in a long-distance call to a friend in Wolverhampton. Dr. Turner won't be back till tomorrow morning, and I'm afraid I don't know how to reach him, said the voice on the other end of the wire. And the flash flickered and died out at the sound. But I can give you Dr. Young's number. I'm not having a baby, said the Saint coldly, and hung up. He leaned back in his chair and said quietly and intensely, God damn. You should complain, said Patricia, you Mormon. She had entered the study from the hall and closed the door again behind her. The Saint looked up from under mildly interrogative brows. I knew you adored me, he said. Well, you have an original line of endearing epithets. What's the origin of this one? Blonde, she said, and voluptuous in a careful way, mushy lips and the old baloney eyes. I bet she wears black lace undies and cuddles like a kitten. She hadn't brought the baby with her, but she's probably got a picture of it. The saint straightened. Not Angela, he ventured breathlessly. I'm not so intimate with her, said Patricia primly, but she gave the name of Miss Lindsay. You ought to recognize your own past when it catches up with you. Simon stood up slowly. He glanced at the closed section of bookcase, beyond which was a secret room where Hoppy Onions was still keeping watch over Mr. Verdine and a case of VAT 69, and his eyes were suddenly filled with an unholy peace. I do recognize her, darling, now that I think of it, he said. This is the one who had the twins. He gripped her arm, and his smile wavered over her in a flicker of ghostly excitement. I ought to have known that she'd catch up with me, and I think this is the break I've been waiting for all day. He went into the living room with a new quickness in his step and a new exhilaration sliding along his nerves. Now that this new angle had developed, he was amazed that he had not been expecting it from the beginning. He had considered every other likely eventuality, but not this one. And yet this was the most obvious one of all. Caskin and Dolph knew who he was, and some of his addresses were found to be in various directories that were at the disposal of anyone who could read. It was not seriously plausible that after the night before they would decide to give up their loot and go away and forget about it, and once they had made up their minds to attempt a comeback, it could only have been a matter of time before they looked for him in Weybridge. The only thing he might not have anticipated was that they would send Angela Lindsay in to open the interview. That was a twist which showed a degree of circumspection that made Simon Templar greet her with more than ordinary watchfulness. Angela, darling, he murmured with an air of pleased surprise. I never thought I should see you in these rural parts. When did you decide to study bird life in the suburbs? It came over me suddenly last night, she said. I began to realize I had missed something. His eyes were quizzically sympathetic. You shouldn't be too discouraged. I don't think you missed it by more than a couple of inches. Perhaps not. But a miss is, I know, as good as in the bush. Exactly. He smiled at her and offered the cigarette box. She took one, and he gave her a light. His movements and his tone of voice were almost glisteningly smooth with exaggerated elegance. He was enjoying his act immensely. A drink, he suggested, but she shook her head. It mightn't be very good for me, so I won't risk it. Besides, I want to try and make a good impression. He was studying her more critically than he had been able to the night before, and it seemed to him that Patricia's description of her was a little less than absolutely fair. She had one of those modern streamlined figures that look boyish until they are examined closely, when they prove to have the same fundamental curves that Grandma used to have. Her mouth and eyes were effective enough, even if the effect was deplorable from a moral standpoint. And although it was true that even a comparatively unworldly observer would scarcely have hesitated for a moment of placing her in her correct category, it was also definitely true that if all the other members of that category had looked like her, Mr. Ebenezer Hogsbottom would have found himself burning a very solitary candle in a jubilantly naughty world. The saint went on looking at her with amiable amusement at the imaginative vistas opened up by that train of thought. He said, You must have made quite an impression on Comrade Verdine, and you drank champagne with him at Brighton. She put her cigarette to her lips and drew lightly at it, while she gazed at him for a second or two in silence. Her face was perfectly composed, but her eyes were fractionally narrowed. I'll give you that one, she said at length. We've been wondering just how much you really knew. Would you care to tell me the rest, or would that be asking too much? Why, of course, said the saint obligingly, if you're interested. It isn't as if I'd be telling you anything you don't know already. He sat down and stretched out his long legs. He looked at the ceiling. He was bluffing, but he felt sure enough of his ground. Caskin and Dolph picked up Verdine on his holiday in Eastbourne. He said Caskin can make himself easy to like when he wants to. It's a stock in trade. They threw you in for an added attraction. Verdine fell for it all. He was having a swell time with a bunch of good fellows, and you were fairly swooning into his manly arms. Made him feel grand and a little bit dizzy. He had to live up to it. Caskin was a sporty gent, and Verdine was ready to show he was a sporty gent too. They got into backing horses, and he always backed winners. Money poured into his lap. He felt even grander. It went to his head, where it was meant to go. He left his boarding house and pranced off to Brighton with you on a wild and gorgeous jag. Simon reached for a cigarette. Then the setback, he went on. You had expensive tastes, and you expected him to go on being a good fellow and a sporty gent. But that looked easy. There was always money in the GGs. With Caskin's expert assistant. So he thought. Only something went haywire. The certainties didn't win, but the next one would always get it back. Verdine began to plunge. He got wilder and wilder as he lost more and more, and he couldn't stop. He was infatuated with you, scared stiff of losing you. He lost more money than he had of his own. He started embezzling a little, maybe. Anyway, he was in the cart. He owed more money than he could hope to pay. Then Caskin and Dolph started to get tough. They told him how he could pay off his debt and make a profit as well. There was plenty of money in the bank every week. It would be very easy to stage a hold-up and get away with it if he was cooperating. Caskin and Dolph would do the job and take all the risk, and all he had to do was give them the layout and make everything easy for them. He'd never be suspected himself, and he'd get his cut afterwards. But if he didn't string along, well, someone might have to tell the head office about him. Verdine knew well enough what happens to bank managers who get into debt, particularly over gambling. He can either play ball or go down the drain. So he said he'd play ball. Am I right? So far. But I hope you aren't going to stop before the important part. All right. Verdine thought some more. By himself. He was sunk, anyhow. He had to rob the bank if he was going to save his own skin. So why shouldn't he keep all the boodle to himself? That's just what he decided to do. The branch is a small one, and nobody would have thought of questioning anything he did. It was easy for him to pack a load of dole into a small valise and take it out with him when he went home to lunch. Just before the hold-up was aimed to take place. Nobody would have thought of asking him what he had in his bag. And as for the money, well, of course the hold-up men would be blamed for getting away with it. But he didn't want Judd and Maury on his tail, so he tipped off the police anonymously, meaning for them to be caught, and feeling pretty sure that nobody would believe any accusations they made about him, or at least not until he had plenty of time to hide it. There were still a few holes in the idea, but he was too desperate to worry about them. His real tragedy was when Caskin and Dolph didn't get caught after all, and came after him to ask questions. Naturally, that's when we all started to get together. And then, the saint raised his head and looked at her again. Maybe I'm very dense, he said apologetically, but isn't that enough? It's almost uncanny, but there's still the most important thing. What would that be? Did you find out what happened to the money? The saint was silent for a moment. He elongated his legs still farther, so that they stretched out over the carpet like a pier. His recumbent body looked as if it were composing itself for sleep. But the eyes that he bent on her were bright and amused and very cheerfully awake. She said, "What are you grinning about?" "I'd just been wondering when it was coming, darling," he murmured. "I know that my dazzling beauty brings admiring sightseers from all quarters like moss to a candle, but they usually want something else as well. It's been very nice to see you and have this little chat, but I was always afraid you were hoping to get something out of it. So this is what it is. Maury and Judd sent you along to get an answer to that question, so they know whether it was safe to bump me off or not. If Verdine is still keeping his mouth shut, they can go ahead and fix me a funeral. But if I found out where it is, I may have even moved it somewhere else by now, and it would be awkward to have me buried before I could tell them where I'd moved it to. Is that all that's worrying you?" "Not altogether," she said without hesitation. "They didn't have to send me for that. I talked them into letting me come because I told them you'd probably talk to me for longer than you talked to them, and anyhow, you wouldn't be so likely to punch me on the nose. But I really did it because I wanted to see you myself." The flicker that passed over Simon's face was almost imperceptible. "I hope it's been worth it," he said flippantly. But he was watching her with a coolly reserved alertness. "That's what you've got to tell me," she said. She looked away from him for a moment, stubbed out her cigarette nervously, looked back at him again with difficult frankness. Her hands moved uncertainly. She went on in a rush. "You see, I know Judd doesn't mean to give me any share. I could trust you. Whatever happens, they're going to give you trouble. I know you can take care of yourself, but I don't suppose you would mind having it made easier for you. I could be on your side without them knowing, and I wouldn't want much." The saint blew 2 smoke rings with leisured care, placing them side by side like the lenses of a pair of horn-rimmed spectacles. It drifted towards the ceiling, enlarging languidly. His face was inscrutable, but behind that pleasantly non-committal mask, he was thinking as quickly as he could. He might have come to any decision, but before he could say anything, there was an interruption. The door was flung open, and Hoppy Unietz crashed in. Mr. Unietz's face was not at all inscrutable. He was as elementarily easy to read as an infant's primer. The ecstatic protrusion of his eyes, the lavish enthusiasm of his breathing, the broad beam that divided his physiognomy into 2 approximately equal halves, and the roseate glow which suffused his homely countenance were all reminiscent of the symptoms of bliss that must have illuminated the features of Archimedes at the epochal moment of his life. He looked like a man who had just made the inspirational discovery of the century in his bath. "It worked, boss," he yelped exultantly. "It worked. The door's in Hogsbottom's bedroom." Chapter 8. Simon Templar kept still. It cost him an heroic effort, but he did it. He felt as if he were balanced on top of a thin glass flagpole in the middle of an earthquake. But he managed to keep the surface of his nonchalance intact. He kept Angela Lindsay's hands always within the radius of his field of vision, and said rather faintly, "What worked?" Mr. Unietz seemed slightly taken aback. "Why, the idea you gave me this afternoon, boss," he explained, as though he saw little need for such childish elucidations. "You remember, you were saying, well, why don't we sock this guy the other way and knock his memory back? I'm thinking about that. That seems okay to me. I ain't got nothing else to do on account of the door's locked and I finished all the scotch. So I hole up and whop him and the tonopet, the end of my Betsy. Well, he's out for a long time, and when he comes round, he still don't seem to know what it's all about. But he's talking about how this guy Hogsbottom gave him a key to look after the house when he goes away. So he goes in and parks the lettuce in Hogsbottom's bedroom. A swell idea, boss, and it works," said Mr. Unietz, still marveling at the genius which he conceived it. The saint felt a clutching contraction under his ribs which was not quite like the gastric hollowness of dismay and defensive tension which might reasonably have been there. It was a second or two before he could get a perspective on it, and when he did so, the realization of what it was made him feel slightly insane. It was simply a wild desire to collapse into helpless laughter. The whole supernal essence of the situation was so immortally ludicrous that he was temporarily incapable of worrying about the fact that Angela Lindsay was a member of the audience. If she'd taken a gun out of her bag and announced she was going to lock them up while she went back to tell Caskin and Dolph the glad news, which would probably have been the most obviously logical thing for her to do, he would probably have been too weak to lift a finger to prevent it. Perhaps the very fact that she made no move to do so did more than anything else to restore him to sobriety. The ache in his chest died away, and his brain forced itself to start work again. He knew that she had a gun in her bag. He had looked for it, and distinguished the outline of it when he first came into the room to meet her, and that was why he never let himself completely lose sight of her hands. But her hands only moved to take another cigarette. She smiled at him as if she was shedding the joke, and struck a match. "Well," he said dryly, "looks like you've got your answer." "To one question," she said. "You haven't answered the other. What shall I tell Judd?" Simon studied her for the space of a couple of pulse beats. In that time he thought with a swiftness and clarity that was almost clairvoyant. He saw every angle, and every prospect, and every possible surprise. He also saw Patricia standing aghast in the doorway behind the gorilla shoulders of Mr. Unietz, and grinned impudently at her. He stood up and put his hand to Angela Lindsay. "Go back and tell Morty and Judd that we found out where the dough was last night," he said. "Verdine had buried it in a flower bed. A couple of pals of mine dug it out in the small hours of this morning and took it to London. They're sitting over it with a pair of machine guns in my apartment in Cornwall House now, and I dare anyone to take it away. That ought to hold them. Then, when you shake them off as soon as you can, and meet me at the Stag and Hounds opposite Weybridge Common in 2 hours from now, we'll take you along with us and show you Hogsbottom's nightshirts. She faced him steadily, but with a suppressed eagerness that played disturbing tricks with her moist lips. You mean that? You'll take me in with you? Just as far as you want to be taken in, kid, said the saint. He escorted her to the front door. There was no car outside, but doubtless Messrs. Caskin and Dolph were waiting for her a little way up the road. He watched her start down the drive, then he closed the door and turned back. You'd look better without the lipstick, said Patricia judicially. He thumbed his nose at her and employed his handkerchief. Excuse me if I seem slightly scatterbrained, he remarked. All this is rather sudden. Too many things have happened in the last few minutes. What would you like to do with the change from 15,000 quid? There ought to be a few bob left after I paid for my last lot of shirts and bought a new distillery for Hoppy. Have you fallen right off the edge? She asked interestedly. Or what is it? At a rough guess, I should say it was probably what? The saint's happy lunacy was too extravagant to cope with. But who cares? Why should so little thing like this cause so much commotion? Have you no faith in human nature? The girl's better nature has revived. My pure and holy personality has done its work on her. Never fails. My shining example made her soul pant for higher things. From now on, she's going to be on the side of the saints, and she's going to take care of Judd and Murray. She's going to lead them for us by the nose into the soup. Meanwhile, Professor Unietz has shaken the scientific world to its foundations with his new and startling treatment for cases of concussion. He's whopped Comrade Verdine on the turnip with the end of its Betsy and banged his memory back. And we're going to lay our hands on 15,000 smackers before we go to bed tonight. And we're going to find all of this boodle in the bedroom of Ebenezer Hogsbottom, of all the superlative places in the world. I ask you, can life hold any more? He exploded out of the hall into the study and went on into the secret room, leaving her staring after him a trifle dazedly. He was bubbling with blissful idiocy, but his mind was cool. He had already diagnosed the effects of the Uniet's treatment so completely that his visit was really only intended to reassure himself that it had actually worked. He studied Verdine cold-bloodedly. The bank manager's eyes were vacant and unrecognizing. He rolled his head monotonously from side to side and kept up a delirious mumble from which the main points of the summary that Oppie Unietz had made were absurdly easy to pick out. Over and over again he reiterated the story. How Mr. Hogsbottom had asked him as a neighbor to keep an eye on the house during some of his absences, how he had been entrusted with a key which he had never remembered to return, and how when he was wondering what to do with the stolen money he had remembered the key and used it to find what should have been an unsuspectable hiding place for his booty. He went on talking about it. He's like this ever since he wakes up, Bobby explained, edging in proudly in behind him. The saint nodded. He did not feel any pity. Robert Verdine was just another man who had strayed unsuccessfully into the paths of common crime, and even though he had been deliberately led astray, the mess that he was now in was directly traceable to nothing but his own weakness and cupidity. In such matters, Simon Templar saved his sympathy for more promising cases. Put his clothes back on him, he said. We'll take him along too. Your operation was miraculous, Hoppy, but the patient is somewhat liable to die, and we don't want to be stuck with his body. Patricia was sitting on the study desk when he emerged again, and she looked at him with sober consideration. I don't want to bore you with the subject, she said, but are you still sure you haven't gone off your rocker? Perfectly sure, he said. I was never rocking so smoothly in my life. Well, do you happen to remember anyone by the name of Teal? He took her arm and chuckled. No, I haven't forgotten, but I don't think he'll be ready for this. He may have ideas about keeping an eye on me, but he won't be watching for Verdine. Not here, anyway. Hell, he's just searched the house from top to bottom and convinced himself we haven't got Verdine here, however much he may be wondering what else we've done with him. And it's getting dark already. By the time we're ready to go, it'll be easy. There may be a patrol car, a motorcycle cop waiting down the road to get on our tail if we go out, but that'll be all. We'll drive around the country a bit first and lose them. Then we'll go into this matter of our old age pensions. She might have been going to say some more, but she didn't. Her mouth closed again, and a little hopeless grimace that was almost a smile at the same time passed over her lips. Her blue eyes summed up a story that has already taken all the volumes of the Saint Saga to tell in words, and she kissed him. "All right, Skipper," she said quietly. "I must be as crazy as you are. I shouldn't be here. We'll do that." He shook his head, holding her. "So we shall. But not you. But I'm sorry, darling, I was talking about the two other guys. You're going to stay out of it because we're going to need you on the outside. Now, in a few minutes I'm going to call Peter, and then I'm going to try and locate Claude Eustace and see if I can get hold of both of them in time. The campaign will proceed as follows." He told it in quick, clean-cut detail, so easily and lucidly that it seemed to be put together with no more effort than it took to understand and remember it. But that was only one of the tricks that sometimes made the Saints' triumph seem deceptively facile. Behind that apparently random improvisation there was the instant decision and almost supernatural foresightness of a strategic genius, which in another age might have conquered empires as debonairly as in this 20th century it had conquered its own amazing empire among thieves. And Patricia Home was a listener to whom very few explanations had to be made more than once. Hoppy Uniet's was a less gifted audience. The primitive machinery of conditioned reflexes which served him for some of the simpler functions of a brain had never been diagnosed for one-shot lubrication. Simon had to go over the same ground with him at least 3 times before the scowl of agony smoothed itself out on Mr. Unitz's rough-hewn facade, indicating that the torture of concentration was over and the idea had finally taken root inside his skull, where at least it could be relied upon to remain with the solidity of an amalgam filling in a well-excavated molar. The evening papers arrived before they left, after the hectic preliminaries of organization were completed, when the Saint was relaxing briefly over a parting glass of sherry, and Mr. Unietz was placidly sluicing his arid tonsils with a fresh bottle of scotch. Patricia glanced through the Evening Standard and giggled. "Your friend Hogsbottom's still in the news," she said. "He's leading a deputation from the National Society for the Preservation of Public Morals to demonstrate outside the London Casino this evening before the dinner-time show. So it looks as if the coast will be clear for you at Chertsey." Probably he heard that Simon was thinking of paying him another call, and hustled himself out of the way like a sensible, peace-loving citizen, said Peter Quinton, who had arrived shortly after that. "If I'd known what I was going to be dragged into before I answered the telephone, I'd have gone off and led a demonstration somewhere myself." The Saint grinned. "We really must do something about Hogsbottom one of these days," he said. It was curious that adventure had begun with Mr. Hogsbottom, and had just led back to Mr. Hogsbottom, and yet he still did not dream how importantly Mr. Hogsbottom was still to be concerned. And that brings us to Chapter 9, and I just realized that I'm hungry. I've not had anything to eat for dinner. I'm going to need to do something about that. Luckily, I've got something here to satiate my appetite. So, on that note, we're going to find someone to raid. Actually, I have a good idea of a few people that we can raid. Let us go wake up our dear friend Lucy Komori, who is going to be my collab partner this weekend. You'll want to be here on Saturday for that. We'll be getting started, stumbling and bumbling our way through Overwatch 2. Never played it before. I'm going to get a little bit of practice in the beginning. Lucy informs me she herself is a bit out of practice on it herself. So, that should make for rather interesting viewing. So let's go ahead and raid our dear lovely Lucy. Which, by the way, if you haven't already, do give her a follow when you get over there. Right, going to be taking tomorrow off. Quick little break. Then we'll be back 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Thursday for Hitman World of Assassination. Should be a fun one. But I will see all of you on Thursday for Hitman World of Assassination. And until then, do give me a follow on across all platforms. LordRexworth.com. LordRexworth.com. If you liked this program tonight, do leave a tip in the tip jar. And don't forget to shop online at LordRexworth.store. Right. I'll see all of you Thursday. Until then, I'm Lord Rexworth, wishing you all the best, and God bless.